Two investors, same age, same $60,000 to invest. On the same Monday, they make one different choice. Ray buys a rental property. Real estate, the thing every rich uncle and every guru on the internet swears is how the wealthy actually get wealthy. Ivy does the boring thing. She drops all $60,000 into a plain index fund and never touches it again. Everyone tells Ivy she's playing it safe. Everyone tells Ray he's building an empire. 30 years later, here's where they stand. Ivy, the lazy one, the one who did nothing but wait, has $1.14 million. Ray, the landlord, the empire builder, has about $876,000. The person who did nothing beat the person who did everything by more than $250,000. And Ray didn't just lose. He spent 11 years feeding that property out of his own pocket, and a decade of weekends answering calls about broken water heaters and unpaid rent. So, stocks win, real estate is a scam, case closed. Not so fast. Because there is one single number about Ray's property. Change it, and Ray doesn't just catch up. He ends with $1.75 million and buries the index fund. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that number is, why almost every property people actually buy gets it wrong, and which of these two investors you are truly built to be. Here's the problem with every real estate versus stocks debate you've ever watched. It's rigged by whoever's selling. The real estate gurus tell you property always wins, right before they sell you a $900 course. The stock crowd tells you index funds always win, and quietly ignores the one weapon real estate has that stocks don't: leverage. Neither side runs the full math. Neither side includes everything. This video includes everything. The leverage, the tenant paying down your loan, the vacancy that empties your bank account, the repairs, the property manager's cut, the capital gains, the depreciation the IRS quietly hands you, the fact that you cannot sell a bedroom when you need cash, and on the other side, the real long-run return of the market, its perfect liquidity, and the concentration risk you take on the day you bet your whole net worth on one roof. By the end, you'll know the exact rule that decides whether a property makes you rich or makes you poor. The tax advantage that lets real estate claw back everything, and the honest answer to which one actually wins. For the person you really are, not the person the guru needs you to be. Let's run the numbers, because they don't lie, but the people telling this story almost always do. Let's build both bets from the ground up, dollar for dollar. Ray takes his $60,000 and buys a $250,000 rental house. He puts 20% down, $50,000, and spends $10,000 on closing costs. His mortgage is $200,000. A 30-year fixed at 7%, which comes to $1,331 a month in principal and interest. The house rents for $1,900 a month. Ivy takes her identical $60,000 and buys a total market index fund. That's it. That's her entire strategy. It earns a normal 9% a year, on average, over the long run, the market's historical range. And she never sells. And to keep this a fair fight, every single month that Ray has to reach into his own pocket to keep his property afloat, Ivy invests that exact same amount into her fund. Same money in. Same 30 years. One boring choice apart. Now, here's the seductive part. The part that makes real estate irresistible. Ray's $60,000 didn't buy $60,000 of asset. It bought a $250,000 house. He's controlling 4 times his money. When that house goes up in value, he collects the gains on all $250,000, not just his down payment. That is leverage, and it is the single most powerful force in real estate. It's also, as Ray is about to learn, the most dangerous, because leverage doesn't care which direction it points. Now here's the thing almost nobody says out loud, the thing the gurus airbrush out of every pitch. Ray is not collecting rent. Ray is paying to own this house. Watch. The house brings in $1,900 a month. But rent is not profit. There's a rule every honest landlord knows, and every beginner ignores. Over the long run, roughly half of your rent gets eaten by the cost of owning the thing. Property taxes, insurance, repairs, the months it sits empty between tenants, the property manager's cut, and the big-ticket capital expenses like a roof or a furnace that don't come every year, but always come. Call it a conservative 48%. So Ray's real net from that $1,900 in rent isn't $1,900. It's about $988, and his mortgage payment is $1,331. Do the subtraction. Ray is losing $343 every single month on his investment. He's not a landlord collecting checks. He's a man writing them, feeding this property $300 a month out of his own paycheck, and he'll keep feeding it for 11 straight years before it finally turns cash flow positive. Meanwhile, every dollar of Ivy's $60,000 has been fully invested and compounding since day one, with zero out-of-pocket and zero phone calls. So who's actually ahead? Let's start the clock and find out. Year 3. Ray's house has appreciated at a normal 3.5% a year. His equity, after selling costs, sits around $67,500. Ivy's index fund? $91,500. Ivy is ahead by $24,000. And she hasn't lifted a finger, while Ray has already fixed a dishwasher and chased a late payment. So far, the boring bet is winning. Year 5. Ray, net of selling costs, $91,600. Ivy, $115,600. The gap is holding at about $24,000, but something is quietly working in Ray's favor, and I don't want you to miss it because it's the entire reason real estate can win it all. Look at his mortgage. Every month, a slice of that payment isn't a cost. It's forced savings. The tenant's rent is slowly paying down Ray's $200,000 loan, one payment at a time. Ray isn't building that equity with his own money. His tenant is building it for him. That's leverage's good twin. Somebody else is buying Ray a house on the installment plan. It's slow, it's invisible, and over 30 years, it's enormous. Hold that thought, because it's about to collide with the costs nobody budgets for. Hidden costs, round 1. That 48% we took off the rent isn't a number I made up to be pessimistic. It's the number that wrecks optimistic landlords. It's the 2 months a year the unit sits empty during a bad tenant turnover. It's the $11,000 special assessment. It's the tenant who stops paying and takes 4 months to remove. It's the 8% the property manager charges so Ray doesn't have to take the 2 a.m. call himself. And if he skips the manager to save that money, he just gave himself a second job. Real estate isn't a stock you forget about. It's a small business that happens to own one product. Year 10. Ray, net, $161,700. Ivy, $190,000. Still ahead by nearly $30,000, and Ray is now 10 years and roughly $24,000 out-of-pocket dollars into this thing. Hidden costs, round 2. The ones with no line item. First, liquidity. If Ivy needs $40,000 tomorrow, she sells a sliver of her fund and has it in 2 days. If Ray needs $40,000, He can't sell the guest bedroom. He either borrows against the house or sells the whole thing and pays a realtor 6% for the privilege. Second, concentration. Ivy owns 500 companies across the whole economy. Ray owns one building on one street, rented to one family, in one city's job market. One bad furnace, one bad tenant, one factory closing across town, and Ray's entire net worth takes the hit at once. Diversification is a free lunch, and Ray isn't eating it. Year 15. Halfway to the finish line. Ray, net of selling costs, $254,000. Ivy, $298,000. Still $44,000 behind. But notice the shape of it. Ray's rent has now climbed past $2,800 a month, while his mortgage hasn't moved a single dollar. His cash flow finally went genuinely positive, and his tenant has paid off a huge chunk of the loan. Real estate's engine, after 15 slow, expensive years, is finally running warm. The only question left is whether finally warm can ever catch hot from day one. Year 20. Ray, net of sale, $389,000. Ivy, $466,000. The gap has grown to $77,000. But watch, Ray's cash flow finally went positive around year 11. His rent has climbed while his mortgage stayed frozen, and his tenant has paid off more than half the loan. Real estate's engine is finally warming up. Is it enough to catch her? Year 30. The mortgage is gone, paid off almost entirely by 30 years of tenants. Ray owns his house free and clear, and after selling costs, he's worth about $876,000. Ivy's index fund, $1.14 million. The boring, lazy, do-nothing index fund won by more than $266,000. And Ivy never once fixed a toilet, screened a tenant, or wrote a check to keep the lights on. If we stopped right here, like the index fund crowd loves to, the headline would be, "Real estate is a scam. Just buy stocks." But that headline is just as dishonest as the gurus. Because Ray didn't lose because real estate is bad. He lost for two specific reasons, and the second one is the whole video. Keep watching. Here's the first reason, and it's the one the stock crowd forgets to price in. Ray's return wasn't passive. Ivy's $880,000 lead came with 0 hours of work. Ray's smaller number came with 30 years of a part-time job. Tenant screening, midnight repairs, evictions, bookkeeping, vacancy scrambles. Add up those hours over 3 decades, and Ray didn't just earn less than Ivy. He earned less than Ivy while working a second job the entire time. On an hourly basis, his investment may have paid him less than minimum wage. That's the part no rental calculator ever shows you. Put a real number on it. Landlording a single unit runs anywhere from 30 to 100 hours a year once you add up the tenant turnovers, the repairs, the bookkeeping, the calls, the drives, the paperwork. Over 30 years, that's easily 1,000+ hours, the equivalent of 6 months of full-time work, poured into an asset that still lost to a fund Ivy glanced at twice a year. Ray didn't just earn a lower return. He paid for that lower return, in the one currency you can never earn back. And this is where the biggest myth in personal finance quietly falls apart. Real estate always goes up. My parents got rich on their house. Here's what actually happened to your parents. They didn't get rich because real estate is magic. They got rich because a mortgage forced them to save every single month for 30 years, whether they wanted to or not, and because they happened to buy in an era of falling interest rates and rising prices. Strip away the forced savings and that once-in-a-generation tailwind, and a house creeping up 3 or 4% a year is a mediocre investment wearing a great one's clothes. Your parents didn't beat the market. They just never sold, and never once checked what the same money would have done in an index fund. Nostalgia is not a rate of return. But here's the second reason, and this is the counterintuitive twist that changes everything. Ray's property wasn't a bad property. It was an average one. He paid a normal price for a normal house that rented for a normal amount. And at today's prices and interest rates, the normal deal is a losing deal, because the rent doesn't cover the cost of the leverage. Ray's leverage didn't work for him. It worked against him, amplifying a mediocre deal into a slow bleed. And that's the secret almost nobody understands about real estate. Leverage doesn't make you rich. Leverage makes you more of whatever your deal already is. A great deal, leveraged, makes you spectacularly rich. A mediocre deal, leveraged, makes you spectacularly tired. So the entire question isn't real estate versus stocks. It's, did you buy a great deal or an average one? And there's one number that tells you which before you ever sign. Here's the number. It's called the 1% rule, and it's the fastest way to know whether a property is an investment or a trap. Take the monthly rent and divide it by the purchase price. If the rent is at least 1% of the price, the deal works. If it's below, the leverage will quietly eat you alive. Run Ray's deal. $1,900 of rent on a $250,000 house. That's 0.76%. Well under the line. That single fact is why Ray spent 11 years feeding his property and lost to a lazy index fund. His rent never covered the cost of controlling that asset, so every advantage of real estate got buried under negative cash flow. Now, meet Tanya. Tanya bought the same priced house, $250,000, but she hunted until she found one that rents for $2,500 a month. That's the 1% rule. Exactly. Same leverage, same 30 years. Same everything. Except now the tenant more than covers the mortgage from day one. Watch what happens when leverage finally points the right way. Tanya ends with $1.37 million. Her identical index fund twin? $889,000. Tanya didn't beat the market because real estate is magic. She beat it because she bought a deal where the numbers worked and then let leverage do to a good deal what it did in reverse to Ray's bad one. And there's a second weapon Tanya has that Ivy will never touch: taxes. The government lets a real estate investor deduct the building's value a little each year. It's called depreciation. A paper loss that can make Tanya's rental income essentially tax-free, and sometimes shelter her other income too. When Ivy finally sells her fund, she owes capital gains tax on every dollar it grew. Tanya can roll her profit into the next property and defer that tax indefinitely, forever, using something called a 1031 exchange. Stocks have no equivalent. And in a hot market, if Tanya's house appreciates at 5% instead of 3.5%, that leverage compounds even harder, and she ends closer to $1.75 million. Leverage on a good deal in an appreciating market, with tax breaks stacked on top, is the closest thing to a cheat code that legal investing has. And I've been generous to Ivy because I only let Tanya buy one house. The real reason experienced investors choose real estate is that it lets you do two things stocks never will: force the result and then multiply it. Tanya can walk into a rundown property, put $20,000 into a kitchen and a coat of paint, and instantly raise both the rent and the value by far more than she spent. That's called forcing appreciation, and there is no equivalent anywhere in the stock market. You cannot renovate the S&P 500. Then she can do something with a name that sounds like a lawnmower. BRRRR. Buy, rehab, rent, refinance, repeat. She refinances the property she just improved, pulls her original down payment back out tax-free, and uses it to buy the next one while keeping the first. Do that a handful of times, and Tanya doesn't own one house beating the market. She owns 5, each with a tenant paying down her loans, each appreciating on its full value, each throwing off tax-sheltered cash flow. That is how real estate fortunes are actually built. Not by buying one rental and waiting, but by using leverage and control to compound faster than an unleveraged fund ever could. It's also a genuine full-time skill, which is exactly the point. The ceiling is far higher, but you are the one who has to climb it. Now, a reality check, because I don't want you to close this video and go buy a bad deal on purpose. In most expensive coastal and big city markets today, the 1% rule is nearly impossible to hit. Prices have run so far ahead of rents that almost every listing is a Ray deal, not a Tanya deal. That's exactly why so many people who invested in real estate over the last decade quietly underperformed a boring index fund without ever realizing it. The Tanya deals still exist, but they live in specific places: cheaper Midwest and Southern markets, smaller multifamily buildings where several tenants share one roof, and value-add properties ugly enough to be cheap and fixable enough to force up. Finding them is real work. That's the whole job. The 1% rule was never a promise that good deals are everywhere. It's a filter that tells you the truth about the deal in front of you, so you don't confuse a house you like with an investment that works. If you can't find one that clears it, that isn't a failure. That's the market telling you, this year, in this place, the index fund is the better landlord. Now, let's be just as honest about Ivy's side, because I'm not here to sell you a rental either. Ivy won the average case with 3 superpowers Ray never had. 1. 0 effort. Not 1 hour, not 1 phone call, not 1 repair, for 30 years. 2. Perfect liquidity. She could turn any slice of her wealth into cash in 48 hours, without a realtor, without a buyer, without permission. 3. Total diversification. She owned the entire economy. No single tenant, furnace, or neighborhood could ever wipe her out. Ray was one disaster away from a very bad year. Every year. Ivy never was. And here's the thing about the leverage that made Tanya rich. It's the same leverage that can destroy you. When you control a $250,000 asset with $60,000, a good market hands you outsized gains. But a bad one, a long vacancy while the mortgage is still due, a crash right when you need to sell, and that same leverage can turn your $60,000 into less than 0. Tanya's upside and Ray's downside are the same tool pointed in opposite directions. Stocks, unleveraged, simply can't hurt you the way an over-leveraged rental can. You can't get a margin call on a house you own outright, but you absolutely can on a mortgage you can't cover. Let me show you the ugly version, because leverage never advertises its downside. Imagine a recession hits in Ray's year 8. He loses his tenant for 5 months, right as his own hours get cut at work. The rent stops, but the mortgage doesn't, because the bank does not care that the economy is bad. Ray burns through his savings covering payments on an empty house, and if the downturn drags on, he's forced to sell into the worst possible market, sometimes for less than he still owes. That's how leverage really ends people. Not slowly, like Ray's mediocre deal, but all at once. Ivy, through that exact same recession, watched her fund fall on paper, kept buying shares on sale through her automatic investing, and never faced a single bill she couldn't skip. Her worst case was a scary statement. Ray's worst case was bankruptcy. Same 30 years. Wildly different floors under your feet. And here's a bridge almost nobody mentions, which quietly settles half of this argument. You can own real estate inside the stock market. They're called REITs, real estate investment trusts. Companies that own apartments, warehouses, data centers, and shopping malls, and hand you the rent as dividends. Buy a REIT index fund and you get a slice of thousands of professionally managed properties. With the liquidity of a stock, the diversification of a fund, and exactly 0 midnight phone calls. You give up the direct leverage and the tax tricks of owning a building yourself, but you get real estate exposure without ever becoming a landlord. For most people who love the idea of real estate but not the reality of it, that's the honest middle path, and it lives entirely inside Ivy's world, not Ray's. So the real dividing line was never property versus stocks. It's two different lines. Passive versus active. Do you want an investment or a second job that might pay more? And diversified versus concentrated. Do you want to own the whole economy or make a focused bet you can control and improve? Real estate and index funds aren't really competing on returns. They're competing on what kind of life you want to live while your money grows. So before we reach the verdict, be honest with yourself about one thing, because it quietly decides the whole answer. Which of these two people are you, actually, in real life, not in the fantasy? Are you the person who will spend weekends analyzing deals, screening tenants, learning the tax code, and negotiating with contractors, treating a stack of buildings like the business it is? Some people genuinely love that. For them, real estate isn't a burden, it's a craft, and it pays like one. Or are you the person who wants to set one automatic transfer, own the entire economy, and never think about it again, while it quietly turns you into a millionaire? Neither answer is wrong, but most people lie to themselves right here. They love the idea of being a real estate mogul and hate the reality of a clogged drain at midnight. And that gap between the fantasy and the follow-through is exactly where Ray deals get bought and fortunes get lost. The math only works if you'll actually do the work the math demands. So here's the honest verdict, and it comes down to that one rule and one question about yourself. Real estate wins, and wins big, if you can actually find or force a deal at or above the 1% rule, if you'll use the tax advantages, if you can stomach the illiquidity and the concentration, and if, be brutally honest, you'll really run it like the business it is. In that case, leverage plus tenant paydown plus tax breaks gives real estate a ceiling stocks simply can't reach. Tanya's 1.37, 1.75 million versus the index's 1.1. But stocks win, quietly, boringly win. If you want to build serious wealth without buying yourself a second job, if you value being able to sell in a day and sleep through the night, and if you're honest that the property you'll actually end up buying is a Ray deal, not a Tanya deal. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people who invest in real estate never find the 1% deal. They buy a normal house at a normal price, tell themselves they're building wealth, and quietly underperform the index fund they could have bought in 30 seconds, while working nights and weekends for the privilege. The deciding number is the 1% rule. Run it before you run anything else. If the deal clears it and you want the work, real estate can make you rich in a way stocks never will. If it doesn't clear it, or you don't want the job, the boring index fund isn't the safe, lazy choice. It's the smarter one. So let's go back to Ray and Ivy, 30 years in. Ray didn't lose to the stock market. He lost to a bad deal and to a story. The story that owning property is automatically wealth, that a mortgage is always a good bet, that being a landlord is the same thing as being an investor. It isn't. Ivy didn't win by being smart or lucky. She won by being diversified, patient, and completely unwilling to confuse activity with progress. Because here's the truth this whole video was built to reveal. The house doesn't build wealth. The deal does. A great deal builds wealth whether it's wrapped in bricks or in shares. A bad deal destroys it just as fast, and leverage only makes it destroy faster. Ray had the bricks and the mortgage and the tenants and the sweat. Everything that looks like wealth building, and none of the one thing that actually is. A deal where the math worked before he ever signed. And Ivy? Ivy owned the one piece of real estate that never sends a special assessment, never calls at 2 a.m., never sits vacant, and never asks you to co-sign your weekends for the next 30 years. She owned the whole economy, and she let it pay her to do nothing. So the next time a guru tells you real estate is how the rich get richer, don't argue. Just do the one thing they hope you won't. Run the number. Take the rent, divide it by the price, and see if it clears 1%. If it does, and you genuinely want to run a business made of bricks and tenants, go build your empire. Real estate at a real deal will make you wealthier than the market ever could. But if that rent can't clear 1%, understand exactly what you'd be buying. You wouldn't be buying an investment. You'd be buying yourself a low-paying second job with a 30-year mortgage attached, and quietly falling behind the boring index fund you could have owned with none of the work. Real estate can absolutely make you rich. But only when the math says yes. Not the mortgage broker, not the guru, not the uncle at Thanksgiving. The math. Run the number first, and let the answer, not the fantasy, decide where your $60,000 goes. So here's what to actually do this week, in 20 minutes, before you let anyone sell you anything. Pull up 3 rental listings in a market you genuinely buy in. For each one, take the realistic monthly rent, not the dream number, the honest one, and divide it by the asking price. If none of them clear 1%, you have your answer, and you just saved yourself 30 years of being an underpaid landlord. Put the money into a low-cost index fund or a REIT fund if you want the real estate flavor, and go live your life. If one of them does clear 1%, and your gut lights up at the thought of running it, then go deeper, because you may have just found the deal that leverage was built for. Either way, you'll have made the decision the way the wealthy actually make it, with a number, not a feeling. The gurus are selling you the fantasy. Ivy and Tanya got rich the same way as each other. They ran the math first, and only signed when it said yes. If this gave you the whole picture instead of half of it, the leverage and the vacancies, the tax breaks and the toilets, subscribe to the GOAT formula and turn on the bell. We run the real math on the money decisions that quietly shape your entire life. No hype, no courses, no agenda. Just the number that holds up in a spreadsheet. I'll see you in the next one.